The axe slipped from Marcus Webb's hands the moment he saw the glowing eyes through the pines. They blinked once, twice, then vanished into the forest darkness that pressed against his half-built cabin, like something alive and hungry. His heart hammered against his ribs as he grabbed the axe from the dirt, knuckles white around the worn handle. 3 months alone in these Montana woods, and nothing had looked at him like that. Nothing on Earth looked at anything like that. The wind died completely. Even the insects went silent. Marcus backed toward his cabin, boots crunching over wood shavings and scattered nails. The walls stood skeletal, gaps between logs showing the night beyond. No door yet, no windows, just frames and promises, and his own stubborn need to disappear from a world that had taken everything from him. The eyes appeared again, closer this time, maybe 30 feet away, hovering 7 feet off the ground between 2 massive firs. They glowed with a soft amber luminescence that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his racing heartbeat. He wasn't drunk. Hadn't touched whiskey in 6 days. This was real. Something moved in the shadows beneath those eyes. A shape too tall and too wrong, shifting through the darkness like oil through water. Marcus raised the axe, though his arms trembled and his breath came in sharp gasps. Then he heard it. A sound that shouldn't exist. A low thrumming hum that resonated in his chest cavity, making his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. Not mechanical, not animal. Something between music and mathematics, between language and pure emotion. The shape stepped into the small circle of light from his battery lamp. Marcus's legs almost gave out. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, her body covered in something that looked like skin but reflected light like scales. Her limbs were too long, joints bending in places that made his brain scream wrong. But her posture held a strange grace. Her face was angular, almost geometric, with those massive amber eyes dominating features that seemed to shift and settle as she studied him. But it was her belly that froze the scream in his throat. Swollen, distended, moving with something alive inside. She was pregnant. The alien took another step forward, and Marcus finally found his voice. The scream that tore from him echoed through the mountains, sending nightbirds exploding from nearby trees. He swung the axe in a wild arc, stumbling backward, his heel catching on a pile of lumber. He crashed hard, pain shooting through his spine. The axe flew from his grip, spinning away into darkness. The creature moved with impossible speed, closing the distance before he could scramble away. She loomed over him, those eyes boring into his soul, and the humming sound intensified until his skull felt ready to split. Then she did something that stopped his panic cold. She placed one elongated hand on her swollen belly and tilted her head. The gesture was unmistakable. Universal. She was asking for help. Marcus lay frozen, every instinct screaming at him to run. But something in those alien eyes held him captive. Not threat. Not malice. Desperation. Fear. The same emotions that had driven him into these woods to escape his own demons. Her other hand extended toward him, long fingers unfurling. The skin between them was translucent, revealing a delicate network of veins that glowed faintly blue. She made that humming sound again, softer now, almost pleading. Marcus's mind raced. 3 months ago, he'd buried his wife and unborn daughter after a drunk driver turned his life into ash and grief. He'd come to these mountains to die slowly, to fade away where nobody would find him or care. The cabin was just something to do with his hands, while his heart stopped working. Now this impossible thing stood before him, carrying life inside her, needing something he didn't understand. She pressed her hand more firmly against her belly. And even in the dim light, Marcus could see the distress in her movements. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He pushed himself up slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. His voice came out rough and uncertain. "Are you hurt?" The creature's eyes widened, head cocking at a sharp angle. She understood tone, if not words. She nodded, a gesture so human it made his breath catch, then gestured toward the forest behind her, toward something hidden in those dark woods. Marcus looked back at his half-built cabin, at the bottle of sleeping pills he'd been rationing for the day he finally found the courage, at the life he'd been trying to abandon. Then he looked at this impossible being who had chosen to reveal herself to him in her moment of need. His wife Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "We help people, Marcus. That's what makes us human." He took a deep breath and nodded. "Show me." She moved through the forest like smoke, her elongated form weaving between trees with an efficiency that made Marcus struggle to keep pace. His flashlight beam bounced erratically as he crashed through underbrush, branches whipping his face, lungs burning. The creature glanced back frequently, those amber eyes tracking him with what he could only interpret as concern. She slowed when he fell behind, waited when he stumbled over roots, emitted that low humming sound that now seemed almost reassuring. They traveled deeper into wilderness Marcus hadn't yet explored, climbing ridges he'd never mapped. His legs screamed protest, muscles still weak from months of barely eating, barely living. But he pushed forward, driven by something he couldn't name. Purpose. Maybe. Or just the gravitational pull of another broken soul. After 20 minutes of brutal hiking, she stopped abruptly at the edge of a ravine. Below, nestled in a small clearing beside a stream, sat something that made Marcus's scientific training wrestle with his sanity. A ship, no other word fit. Roughly oval, maybe 40 feet long, its surface darker than the surrounding night and covered in patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly. It sat at an angle, one side partially buried in torn earth, surrounded by scorched vegetation. A crash landing. The creature descended the ravine with fluid grace, using her long limbs to navigate the steep slope like a spider. Marcus followed more carefully, half sliding, grabbing saplings to slow his descent. His mind cataloged details despite his racing heart. No visible engines. No seams or rivets. The hull looked organic somehow. Grown, rather than built. She led him to an opening that dilated like a pupil, revealing interior darkness lit by weak bioluminescent strips along curved walls. The air that wafted out smelled strange, sweet and metallic, like honey mixed with copper. Marcus hesitated at the threshold. Every human instinct screamed danger. Trap. But the creature had already entered, turning back to make that humming sound again. Beckoning. He stepped inside. The interior was cramped even for him, impossibly tight for her 8-foot frame. She moved, hunched, careful, leading him through a narrow corridor that curved like the inside of a nautilus shell. The walls felt warm, almost alive, pulsing faintly. They emerged into a slightly larger chamber. Marcus's flashlight illuminated something that made his stomach drop. Equipment. Medical equipment, or whatever passed for it in her species. Tubes and devices with purposes he couldn't guess. Many of them dark, clearly damaged. Screens flickered with alien symbols, before dying completely. She moved to a platform in the chamber's center, and lowered herself onto it with visible effort. Her breathing had changed. Faster, more labored. She pressed both hands to her distended belly, and the humming sound she made was definitely pain. Marcus approached slowly, flashlight sweeping over her. Up close, he could see subtle details. The way her skin rippled with what might be muscle contractions. The slight tremor in her elongated fingers. The sheen of something like sweat on her geometric face. She was going into labor. Alone. In a crashed ship on an alien world, with medical systems that had failed. Jesus. Marcus whispered. His own grief crashed over him like a wave. Sarah, dying in that hospital bed. Their daughter, never taking a first breath. The helplessness that had eaten him alive for 3 months. The creature made a sharp sound, different from before. Urgent. She pointed to one of the dark screens, then to her belly. Then made a pulling motion with her hands. She repeated this sequence twice more, her movements becoming more frantic. Marcus forced himself to think past the impossibility. She was trying to communicate. The equipment was supposed to do something. Help somehow. But it was dead. He moved to the nearest device, examining it with his engineer's eye. No buttons he could identify. No obvious power source. But there were connections. Ports that fed into other systems. He followed cables with his flashlight, tracing pathways through the damaged ship. Most led to a central chamber deeper in. He gestured for her to wait, and squeezed through another narrow passage. What he found looked like a power core. Or had been. The crystal structure at its center was shattered, pieces floating in some kind of suspension field that flickered weakly. Whatever energy had sustained this ship was dying. But there was his portable generator back at the cabin. Old diesel, loud as hell, but functional. Marcus hurried back to the medical chamber. The creature's condition had worsened. Her breathing came in sharp gasps, and that humming sound carried notes of distress that needed no translation. He pointed to himself, then toward the ravine. I need to get something. Equipment. Understand? I'll come back. She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her long fingers wrapping completely around his forearm. Those amber eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, he felt something pass between them. Not words, deeper than words. A connection that transcended species. Trust. She released him and nodded, then curled around her belly with a sound that broke his heart. Marcus ran. He crashed back through the forest, no longer caring about the branches that tore his skin or the roots that threatened to snap his ankles. The generator weighed 70 pounds, and it was a mile back to the cabin. Simple math, impossible math, but Sarah's voice pushed him forward. We help people, Marcus. This wasn't people. This was something beyond his comprehension, but she was someone scared and alone and about to give birth in the darkness. That was enough. Marcus's cabin appeared through the trees like salvation. He burst into the skeletal structure, nearly tripping over lumber in his desperation. The generator sat exactly where he'd left it, covered by a tarp beside his toolbox. He yanked the cover away, checking fuel levels by flashlight. Half a tank. Maybe enough. He grabbed the generator's handle, testing the weight. 70 pounds felt like 200 after the run, but adrenaline transformed him into something beyond exhaustion. He hoisted it, muscles screaming protest, and started back toward the ravine. The first 100 yards nearly killed him. His grip kept slipping, sweat making everything treacherous. He had to stop 3 times to adjust his hold, precious seconds draining away. In his mind, he saw that alien creature alone in her dying ship, felt her desperation, as clearly as his own, had been the day he'd packed his truck and driven toward these mountains to disappear. A branch caught his foot on the 4th stop. He went down hard, the generator slamming into the dirt beside him. His ankle twisted, white-hot pain shooting up his leg. For a moment, he lay there in the darkness, breathing hard, tasting blood from where he'd bitten his tongue. This was insane, utterly insane. He should be back at the cabin, calling emergency services, letting the government handle this. Let them deal with crashed spaceships and alien mothers and impossible situations. But even as these thoughts formed, he was pushing himself up, testing weight on his injured ankle. It held. Barely. He gripped the generator again, jaw clenched against the pain, and kept moving. The humming reached him before he saw the ship, louder than before, resonating through the forest like a pulse of pure distress. It drove him faster. Pain forgotten. Common sense abandoned. He half fell down the ravine slope, generator clutched to his chest, sliding the last 15 feet on his back. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, but he scrambled up, dragging his burden toward the dilated opening. Inside, the corridor felt tighter, more oppressive. The bioluminescent strips had dimmed further. The ship itself seemed to be dying along with its occupant. The medical chamber had transformed into something from a nightmare. The alien creature writhed on the platform, her body contorting in ways that hurt to watch. Her skin had changed color, darker now, almost black in places. The humming came in waves, building to peaks that made Marcus's ears ring. She saw him and reached out, fingers splaying in desperate relief. Marcus set the generator down, hands shaking. Okay, okay. We're going to figure this out. He spoke more to calm himself than to communicate with her. He traced the cable connections again, following them to where they interfaced with the dead power core. The ports were organic-looking. Nothing like electrical plugs, he knew. But energy was energy. Current was current. His toolbox held wire, electrical tape, and jumper cables from his truck. Not enough. Not nearly enough. He needed something to bridge the gap between human technology and whatever this alien system required. The creature made a sound that was almost a scream. Her belly rippled with violent movement. Whatever was inside was ready to emerge. Regardless of whether systems were functional, Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. The ship's systems must have operated on some form of bioelectric current. Her species must generate it naturally, which meant the connections weren't just about raw power. They needed specific frequencies, specific patterns. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Those glowing veins in her translucent skin. They pulsed with light in rhythm with her distress calls. Bioelectricity, made visible. I need you to do something, he said, moving to her side. He took her hand, the one with the most visible veins, and pressed it against one of the connection ports. Then he grabbed the jumper cables, connected them to the generator, and positioned the other ends near her wrist. She understood immediately. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head violently. The risk was obvious even across species. Too much current could kill her. I know, Marcus said softly. But your baby dies if we don't try. You both die. She stared at him for a long moment, those amber eyes searching his face. Then she gave a small nod and pressed her palm more firmly against the port. Marcus started the generator. It roared to life, deafening in the enclosed space, filling the chamber with diesel fumes. He adjusted the output, starting low, watching her face for any sign of distress beyond what she already showed. Nothing happened. He increased power incrementally. The creature's breathing grew more labored, her humming sound becoming a steady drone of pain. The screens flickered. Marcus held his breath, fine-tuning the generator's output. The creature's hand began to glow brighter where it touched the port. Her veins illuminated, light racing up her arm like liquid fire. The medical equipment suddenly blazed to life. Screens displayed flowing symbols. Devices hummed and extended appendages toward the creature's swollen belly. The entire chamber brightened as systems came online. Then she screamed, not a humming sound. An actual scream that transcended species and resonated with pure agony. Her free hand clutched Marcus's shoulder, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Her body arched, something pushing against her belly from the inside, with terrifying force. The medical equipment moved with purpose now, devices positioning themselves around her. One extended something like a scanner, projecting a three-dimensional image above her body. Marcus saw it clearly, the infant inside her. Tangled, wrapped in what must be an umbilical equivalent. Suffocating. The equipment made adjustments, appendages extending toward her. But something was wrong. The devices stuttered, stopped, started again. The power flow wasn't consistent. The generator alone couldn't match what her species' technology required. Marcus looked at the hand pressed to the port, then at his own hands. Bioelectricity. He'd read about it in college. The human body generated electrical signals. Small, but measurable. Neurons firing, heart beating, all of it creating subtle currents. Without thinking, he pressed his hand against the port beside hers. The shock hit him like being struck by lightning. Every muscle in his body seized. His vision went white. He felt his heart skip. Restart. Race into a chaotic rhythm. Pain beyond description coursed through him, but he couldn't pull away. His hand was locked to the port, muscles contracting involuntarily. Through the agony, he heard the equipment stabilize. The humming became steady, purposeful. The creature's screams changed pitch, becoming focused, directed. Then, Marcus saw it. Through streaming eyes and sparking vision, he watched the medical devices work with precision. Appendages extended inside her body, through an opening that dilated naturally. They moved with gentle efficiency, carefully unwrapping the tangled infant, adjusting position, guiding it toward birth. The creature's grip on his shoulder tightened until he thought bones would break. She made sounds that needed no translation. The universal language of bringing life into the world. The infant emerged in a rush of luminescent fluid, smaller than Marcus expected, maybe the size of a human newborn. Its skin was lighter than its mother's, almost translucent, revealing the glow of tiny veins beneath. It didn't cry. Instead, it made a soft, trilling sound, pure and clear. The medical equipment caught the infant gently, cleaned it with gentle appendages, then severed the umbilical connection with what looked like focused light. More devices scanned the tiny form, symbols flowing across screens too fast for Marcus to track. Then, the equipment carefully placed the infant on its mother's chest. The creature's hand finally released the port, and Marcus's did the same. He collapsed to the floor, every nerve ending screaming. His heart hammered erratically. He could smell his own burned flesh where the current had entered. But through the pain, he watched the alien mother curl around her newborn. She made sounds so tender they brought tears to his eyes. Her long fingers traced the infant's face with infinite gentleness. The baby responded with those trilling sounds, tiny hands reaching up to touch its mother. For a moment, the universe shrank to just that. Mother and child. Life continuing, despite impossible odds. Marcus didn't know how long he lay on the floor of the alien ship, watching mother and child bond in their own language of touch and sound. His body felt distant, disconnected. Burns on his hand throbbed in time with his irregular heartbeat. The generator continued its steady roar, maintaining power to systems that now monitored both aliens with calm efficiency. The infant's trilling sounds gradually settled into something rhythmic, almost like purring. Its tiny chest rose and fell steadily. The mother's humming had transformed too, becoming a lullaby that resonated in Marcus's bones with unexpected beauty. But the peace was temporary. The screens around them began displaying symbols that pulsed red. Even without understanding the language, Marcus recognized alarm. The mother saw them too. Her eyes widened, amber light flickering with what looked like fear. She tried to sit up, cradling her infant, but weakness made her movements clumsy. She'd lost a lot of fluid during birth, and her skin had taken on a grayish tinge that looked wrong even for her species. Marcus forced himself upright, fighting waves of dizziness. "What is it? What's wrong?" She pointed to the largest screen, where a three-dimensional image rotated slowly. Marcus squinted, trying to make sense of alien anatomy. Then, he understood. Her body, something inside, was damaged, torn, bleeding internally based on the dark spots spreading through the displayed organs. Complications from the birth. She was dying. The medical equipment extended more appendages toward her, but half of them sparked and retracted. The generator's power was enough to keep systems running, but not enough to perform complex surgical procedures. Marcus watched helplessly as the alien technology tried and failed to address the damage. The mother seemed to understand her situation. She made a sound that carried resignation, almost acceptance, and pulled her infant closer. She looked at Marcus with those expressive eyes, and somehow he knew what she was asking. "Take care of my baby." "No," Marcus said, shaking his head violently. "No. We're not doing this. We're not giving up." But what could he do? He was a structural engineer, not a doctor. He had no understanding of alien physiology. The equipment designed to save her couldn't function properly on generator power alone, unless they had more power. Marcus's eyes fell on the shattered power core deeper in the ship. Crystal fragments floating in a dying containment field. He'd assumed it was completely dead. But the field itself still existed. That meant residual energy remained trapped in the structure. He pulled himself up using the wall, his burned hand protesting every movement. The mother made a questioning hum, watching him with confused concern. "Stay with your baby," Marcus said, moving toward the passage to the power chamber. "Just stay alive. Please." The chamber was darker now, the containment field barely visible as a shimmer in the air. The crystal fragments drifted slowly within it, each piece still emanating faint light, dead stars waiting to go completely dark. Marcus examined the structure. The crystals had been arranged in a specific geometry before the crash, each piece positioned to channel energy in particular patterns. Now they floated randomly, their stored power leaking away unused. He didn't understand the science, couldn't. But he understood systems. Everything was a system. Input, process, output. This core had taken some form of energy as input, processed it through crystalline structures, and output power for the ship. The containment field was still trying to maintain that geometry, still trying to function. It just needed the pieces moved back into proper alignment. Marcus reached toward the field, then stopped. If he disrupted it completely, whatever power remained would dissipate instantly. He needed to work within it, somehow manipulate the fragments without breaking the containment. He looked at his burned hand, still throbbing from the bioelectric connection. This time, he pressed both hands into the containment field. The sensation was different from before. Not the violent shock of electrical current, but something more subtle, like pushing through thick water or molasses made of energy. His hands moved slowly, meeting resistance from forces he couldn't see or understand. The crystal fragments responded to his touch. They drifted toward his fingers, drawn by his body's bioelectric field. He could feel them humming, resonating with frequencies that made his teeth ache. Marcus began moving pieces, guiding them into what looked like the original configuration based on score marks on the chamber walls. One by one, he positioned fragments, trying to recreate geometry destroyed in the crash. Sweat poured down his face. His arms shook with effort. Every piece required intense concentration to move within the containment field. His burned hand felt like it was being held over an open flame. Behind him, he heard sounds from the medical chamber. The infant's trilling became distressed. The mother's humming grew weaker. He had minutes at most. Marcus worked faster, ignoring pain, ignoring exhaustion. The crystals began to glow brighter as they moved into alignment. Power started flowing between fragments, weak at first, then building. The containment field strengthened, its shimmer becoming visible even in the darkness. The last fragment was the largest, positioned at the configuration's center. Marcus could barely move it, the resistance almost too great for his failing strength. He planted his feet, pushed with everything he had left, and screamed with effort. The crystal slipped into place with an audible click that resonated through the ship's hull. Light exploded through the chamber, blinding and beautiful. The power core came fully alive, fragments orbiting each other in complex patterns, generating cascading waves of energy that poured into the ship's systems. Marcus was thrown backward, his hands smoking where they'd been immersed in the field. He hit the curved wall hard, vision swimming, but he heard it. The ship coming alive, systems throughout the vessel, humming with renewed power, medical equipment in the next chamber operating at full capacity. He crawled back to the medical chamber, barely conscious. The scene before him seemed pulled from a dream. The alien mother lay surrounded by actively working devices, appendages, working with precise purpose inside her body, repairing damage with focused energy beams and what looked like accelerated tissue growth. The infant rested in a suspended cradle nearby, still trilling softly, watched over by monitoring systems. The mother's eyes found Marcus. She raised one trembling hand toward him, fingers splaying in what he now recognized as gratitude. He reached back, their fingers touching briefly before darkness took him. Marcus woke to silence. The generator had stopped, and the ship's bioluminescent strips, provided only gentle illumination. His entire body ached, with a depth that suggested he'd been unconscious for hours, maybe days. He pushed himself up slowly, cataloging damage. Burns on both hands, though they'd been treated with something that had created a thin, translucent layer over the wounds. Bruises everywhere, but alive. Impossibly, wonderfully alive. The medical chamber was empty. Panic seized him until he heard sounds from deeper in the ship. Humming. The soft trilling of an infant. Moving. Marcus followed the sounds through passages that no longer felt threatening. The ship seemed warmer, somehow. More welcoming. He found them in what must have been living quarters, a curved space with surfaces that adjusted to form furniture when touched. The mother sat with her infant cradled against her chest, rocking gently. Her color had returned, skin gleaming with health. She saw Marcus and made a sound of welcome, gesturing for him to approach. He sat carefully on a surface that molded itself to his shape. Up close, the infant was remarkable. Its features were more delicate than its mother's, eyes huge and curious as they tracked movement. When it noticed Marcus, it trilled and reached tiny hands toward him. The mother gently placed the infant in his arms. Marcus held the small form carefully, afraid he might break something, but the baby felt sturdy, warm. Its skin surprisingly soft beneath the scale-like texture. It looked up at him with eyes that already showed intelligence, curiosity, trust. Something inside Marcus, something he'd thought died with Sarah and their daughter, stirred painfully back to life. The mother watched them with what could only be maternal satisfaction. Then she began to communicate, pressing a hand to her chest. The gesture was clear. A name, or the equivalent. Marcus repeated the gesture. Marcus. She tried to form the word, her mouth not quite shaped for human speech. What emerged was close but softer, almost melodic. Mar. Kess. He smiled despite everything. Then pointed to the infant. The mother's expression became complex. She made sounds he couldn't hope to reproduce, then seemed to think for a moment. Finally, she pointed to the infant and hummed a single, pure note, high and clear, like crystal ringing. Bell, Marcus found himself saying. That sounds like a bell. The mother tilted her head, considering. Then she nodded and hummed the note again. Bell it was. Over the next hour, they communicated through gestures, sounds, and increasingly through the emotional resonance of the mother's humming. Marcus learned that her name translated roughly to something like dawn, at least in the feelings it evoked. He learned that she'd been traveling alone, fleeing something she couldn't adequately explain through their limited communication. He understood danger, persecution, and desperate flight. She'd crashed 3 weeks ago, had been hiding since then, surviving on stored supplies and trying to repair systems. When her pregnancy began complications, she'd panicked, not knowing what to do on this alien world. Then, she'd seen his lights through the trees, watched him building his cabin, studied him for days, trying to determine if he was threat or potential help. She'd seen his isolation, his grief, worn openly in every movement, recognized a fellow soul in pain. Dawn touched his hand gently, then placed her palm against his chest. The humming she made carried layers of meaning. Thank you. You saved us. You're Pack now. That last concept hit him hard. Pack. Family. The thing he'd lost, and thought he'd never have again. Then Dawn's expression shifted. She moved to a panel on the wall, touching it in specific patterns. A screen materialized, displaying symbols that began cycling rapidly. She studied them intently, her posture tensing. When she turned back to Marcus, fear showed clearly in her eyes. She pointed to the screen, then upward through the ship's hull, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed everything. More of her kind were coming, looking for her. She pantomimed violence, showed him what would happen if they found her. The gestures made him sick. They'd kill her, take Belle, Dawn had escaped something terrible, and now it was catching up. How long? Marcus asked, pointing to the screen, then miming the passage of time. Dawn held up 4 fingers, then clenched and opened her hand 3 times. Marcus calculated. Roughly 12 hours, give or take. They'd arrive by dawn. He stood, mind racing. Dawn had saved herself, and Belle, but she was still weak from childbirth. The ship was functional, but damaged. She couldn't leave orbit and risk Belle's fragile life in space travel. They were trapped, unless they weren't trapped in the ship at all. Marcus gestured for Dawn to follow him. He led her through the corridor, out through the dilated opening, and up the ravine slope. She moved slowly, carefully, Belle cradled in one arm. At the top, Marcus pointed toward his cabin, barely visible through the trees. Then he began explaining his plan through gestures, drawings in the dirt, and sheer determination to make her understand. If her people were looking for the ship, they'd find it, but they wouldn't necessarily find her and Belle if they weren't in the ship. His cabin wasn't much, but it was human construction, human materials, hidden in dense forest. To alien scanners, it might not register as shelter at all. They could hide in plain sight. Dawn listened, her sharp mind processing the implications. She looked at her ship, at her infant, at Marcus, then back at his half-built cabin. Finally, she nodded. They spent the remaining hours preparing. Dawn gathered supplies from the ship, items Marcus couldn't identify, but assumed were necessities for Belle. He helped her carry everything up the ravine, his injured ankle protesting but holding. At the cabin, Marcus worked frantically to make it more livable. He hung tarps to cover the open walls, created a sheltered space in the corner where Dawn could rest with Belle. He moved his own supplies around, trying to create some semblance of protection. Dawn watched him work, occasionally helping with her superior strength. Despite the danger approaching, despite exhaustion from recent childbirth, she moved with purpose. Survival mode. Marcus recognized it because he'd been living in it himself for months. As the night deepened, they sat together in the cabin's dim interior. Belle slept in a makeshift bed Dawn had created from materials that looked soft but strong. The infant's trilling had quieted to almost nothing, just the whisper of breath. Dawn made a low humming sound, and Marcus looked at her. She pointed to him, to herself, to Belle, then clasped her hands together. The meaning was clear. Whatever came, they'd face it together. Marcus nodded. For the first time in 3 months, he had something to protect beyond his own desire to fade away. 2 alien refugees who'd crashed into his isolation and reminded him that life persisted even through unimaginable pain. He checked his supplies. His hunting rifle, cleaned but not fired since he'd arrived. Not much against whatever technology might be coming, but something. His axe. Tools that could be weapons if necessary. Dawn produced something from her supplies, a device that fit in her palm. When she activated it, it hummed with familiar energy, and Marcus saw it project a field around itself. Some kind of shielding, maybe. She placed it near Belle's sleeping form. They settled in to wait. Marcus sat near the cabin's opening, rifle across his lap, watching the forest. Dawn positioned herself between him and Belle, every inch of her posture radiating protective determination. The night pressed close, filled with the sounds of normal wilderness. Owls hooting, small creatures moving through underbrush, wind sighing through pines. Then, as the sky began to lighten with approaching dawn, everything went silent. Just like the night Marcus had first seen Dawn's glowing eyes. She tensed beside him, humming a warning so low, he felt it more than heard it. They were here. The light came first. Not from the rising sun, but from above, lancing down through the forest canopy in beams that turned night into artificial day. Marcus squinted against the glare, raising a hand to shield his eyes. Through the gaps in his tarp walls, he saw Dawn curl around Belle, her body becoming a living shield. The beams swept methodically through the trees, searching. Where they touched, Vegetation withered and blackened. Birds fell from branches, dead before hitting the ground. Whatever these lights were, they were weapons as much as tools. Marcus's grip tightened on the rifle. Useless against this technology. But his hands needed something to hold. A sound filled the air, similar to Dawn's humming but harsher, more mechanical. It resonated at frequencies that made Marcus's bones ache and his vision blur. Through the distortion, he saw shapes descending through the light beams. 3 of them. Larger than Dawn, their bodies armored with technology that gleamed like black chrome. They moved with military precision, spreading out in a search pattern. One moved toward the ravine where the ship lay hidden. The other 2 swept through the forest, their scan beams cutting through darkness and living matter with equal ease. Dawn made the softest sound, barely audible. Marcus looked back at her. She was trembling, her eyes wide with terror. Both arms wrapped around her sleeping infant. She'd fled these beings across light years, crashed on an alien world, suffered through complications that nearly killed her, all to escape what was now descending through the trees. Marcus understood with sudden clarity. Dawn hadn't just been traveling. She'd been running. And Belle wasn't just her child. Belle was evidence. Proof of something these hunters wanted destroyed. One of the armored figures moved closer, now only 50 feet from the cabin. Its scan beams swept left, then right, moving in their direction. Where the light touched Marcus's lumber piles, the wood disintegrated into ash. Marcus stood slowly, rifle raised even though he knew it was meaningless. If that beam hit them, they'd have seconds before dying. But he'd be damned if he'd die hiding behind tarps. The beam swept closer. 30 feet. 20. Then it stopped, pulled upward by some signal Marcus couldn't detect. The armored figure turned, moving swiftly back toward the ravine. The other 2 converged on the same location, their movements suggesting urgency. They'd found the ship. Through the trees, Marcus saw lights intensify around the ravine, heard sounds of metal screaming, technology tearing through metal, and whatever alien materials composed the hull. They were ripping the ship apart, searching for Dawn and Belle with methodical brutality. Dawn's humming changed pitch, becoming something like weeping. She was watching her ship be destroyed. Her only way off this world reduced to scrap and memory. Marcus moved to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, then leaned into the touch, drawing comfort where she could find it. They waited in tense silence as the destruction continued. Minutes stretched into an hour. The sounds of searching grew more frustrated, more violent. The hunters knew Dawn had been there, knew she'd given birth based on evidence they'd found. But they couldn't find her or the infant. Marcus's plan was working. For now. Then one of the armored figures emerged from the ravine. It stood at the top, its scan beam sweeping in wider and wider circles, searching the forest itself now, expanding the perimeter. It was only a matter of time before they checked every structure, every possible hiding place. The cabin would be discovered. Their refuge would become their tomb. Marcus looked at Dawn, at Belle sleeping peacefully despite the chaos outside, at his own burned hands that had channeled alien power to save their lives. He thought about Sarah and their daughter, about the family he'd lost and the impossible new one he'd found in his isolation. An idea formed. Insane, probably suicidal. But the only chance they had. He pointed to Dawn, then to Belle, then made a staying gesture. She needed to remain hidden with the infant, needed to stay silent, no matter what happened. She understood immediately and shook her head violently, grabbing his arm. Her humming carried clear meaning. Don't go. Don't sacrifice yourself. But Marcus had spent 3 months wanting to die, had come to these mountains specifically to fade away. If his death could save these 2 beings who'd reminded him what life meant, what family meant, then it was a death with purpose. He gently removed her hand and grabbed his axe. Better than the rifle. More personal. If he was going to do this, he'd do it face to face. Marcus stepped out of the cabin before Dawn could stop him. He walked deliberately toward the ravine, axe over his shoulder, making no attempt at stealth. The armored figure spotted him immediately. Its scan beam locked onto him, and he felt the energy burning against his skin even at a distance. The other two figures emerged from the ravine, converging on his position. Marcus kept walking. His heart hammered, but his steps were steady. The axe felt good in his hands. Solid. Real. The three figures surrounded him, their forms towering even beyond Dawn's impressive height. Up close, he could see details. Their armor wasn't just technology. It was integrated with their bodies, part of them. Biomechanical hybrids, built for hunting and killing. The lead figure made sounds that hurt Marcus's ears, clearly attempting communication. When he didn't respond in kind, it raised one arm. The limb transformed, mechanical parts shifting and reconfiguring into something that was definitely a weapon. Marcus raised his axe. Ridiculous, but defiant. The weapon charged with visible energy, light building at its core. Then Dawn stepped out of the cabin. She moved into the clearing with Belle cradled against her chest, her posture radiating protective fury despite her weakened condition. She placed herself between Marcus and the hunters, humming sounds that carried challenge and defiance. The lead hunter's weapon discharge aborted. All three figures focused on Dawn, their body language shifting from predatory to something more complex. Surprise. Maybe. Or recognition. Dawn hummed again, longer this time, and Marcus heard layers of meaning even without understanding the language. Accusation. Condemnation. She was speaking truth to power, calling out their violence, their persecution. One of the other hunters responded with harsh mechanical sounds. The exchange was clearly argument, clearly heated. Dawn gestured to Belle, to Marcus, to the destroyed ship. Her humming rose in pitch and intensity, building to something that resonated through the forest like a war cry. Marcus didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. She was defending her right to exist. Belle's right to exist. Their right to refuge and peace. The lead hunter's weapon lowered slightly. It made sounds that seemed questioning. Dawn responded. Softer now, holding Belle out slightly so the hunters could see her infant clearly. Belle chose that moment to wake. The infant's eyes opened, reflecting the morning light, and she trilled that pure, clear note that Marcus had named her for. Something shifted in the hunters. Marcus saw it in their posture, heard it in the way their mechanical sounds changed frequency. They were seeing Belle not as evidence to destroy, but as a living being. An infant. Dawn pressed her advantage, humming continuously, showing Belle's tiny hands, her perfect features, everything that marked her as alive and worthy of protection. The hunters communicated among themselves, sounds passing between them in rapid exchange. Marcus held his breath, axe still raised, ready to fight, even though he knew it was meaningless. Finally, the lead hunter lowered its weapon completely. It made a sound toward Dawn, then turned and gestured to the other two. They hesitated, clearly conflicted, but eventually followed. The three figures moved back toward the ravine, their scan beams deactivating. At the edge, the lead hunter turned back one final time, looked at Dawn and Belle for a long moment, then made a sound that might have been farewell, or warning, or both. Then they were gone, rising on those beams of light back toward whatever ship waited above the cloud cover. Marcus and Dawn stood frozen, barely believing what had happened. Belle trilled softly, reaching up to touch her mother's face. The light beams faded. The oppressive energy dissipated. Normal forest sounds gradually returned as birds and insects dared to move again. They'd survived. Dawn turned to Marcus, her eyes gleaming with tears that looked remarkably human. She hummed a long, complex sound that needed no translation. Thank you. You stood with us. You're family now. Marcus lowered his axe, his whole body starting to shake as adrenaline drained away. He looked at this alien mother and her infant, at these impossible beings who'd crashed into his isolation and forced him back into life. "Yeah," he said softly. "Family." Over the following weeks, they built something unexpected in those Montana woods. Dawn helped Marcus finish the cabin, her superior strength and problem-solving making quick work of construction. In return, he taught her what he could about Earth, about human culture, about how to survive in this new world. Belle grew rapidly, her development far faster than human infants. Within days, she could move independently. Within weeks, she could communicate through increasingly complex, trilling sounds. She treated Marcus as a second parent, reaching for him with the same trust she showed her mother. The ship in the ravine became a source of salvage. Dawn carefully extracted technology she could use, adapting it to work with Earth materials. She built communication devices that let them understand each other more clearly, though they still relied heavily on humming and gesture. Marcus told her about Sarah and their daughter, about the grief that had driven him into isolation. Dawn listened with patience and humming sounds that carried empathy across species boundaries. She told him about Belle's father, lost in the persecution that had driven her to flee. They shared their pain, found comfort in mutual understanding, and slowly, Marcus healed, not forgetting his losses but learning to carry them while still moving forward. Dawn and Belle gave him purpose, gave him something beyond his own pain to care about. They heard news sometimes on Marcus's old radio, reports of strange lights in the sky that night, dismissed by authorities as meteors or atmospheric phenomena. No one came searching for crashed ships or alien refugees. The world went on, ignorant of what hid in the Montana wilderness. That was fine with them. On quiet evenings, Marcus would sit with Dawn and Belle on the cabin's completed porch, watching sunset paint the mountains gold. Belle would trill her songs, Dawn would hum harmonies, and Marcus would sometimes add his own voice, rough but earnest. They were a family forged from loneliness and loss, from chance encounter and desperate survival. Not traditional, not possible by any reasonable standard, but real. And that was enough.